You're listening to Health Innovators, a podcast and video show about the leaders, influencers, and early adopters who are shaping the future of healthcare. I'm your host, Dr. Roxy Mooney. Welcome back, Health Innovators. On today's episode, I'm sitting down with Dave Dolan, who is the executive chairman and co-founder of MultiFunctional Imaging. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Roxy, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a joy to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. So tell us a little bit about your background and what you've been innovating these days.
Great. Well, thanks. I am a medtech veteran. I've been in the industry for just over 20 years. I cut my teeth at GE Healthcare in the diagnostic imaging space, both capital equipment as well as services. As my career has progressed, I've moved on to more agile and innovative companies as my career has progressed. After my stint at GE, I was the GM and platform leader for Becton Dickinson's infusion therapy unit. Then went on to Biosense Webster, which is the electrophysiology unit of Johnson & Johnson. And I worked for Acutus Medical for a spin, and then co-founded MultiFunctional Imaging back in 2013 with my partner, Dan Cattermas. So what we are is we're an early stage commercial company. And what we do is we specialize in making PET and PET CT scanners run more efficiently. So, for instance, in the world of cardiac PET, which is the gold standard for cardiac imaging, depending on the radio tracer that a nuclear medicine technician or a cardiologist would utilize, the scan takes about 80 to 90 minutes. What our software does is able to condense that time and actually be able to conduct the rest and stress or myocardial perfusion imaging scan in about 15 to 20 minutes. And so what you get is you get the economies of scale, you get much more of an efficient process, and most importantly, the patient benefits from a much shorter duration of the scan that can, quite frankly, be pretty intimidating when you look at it from a patient standpoint.
Sure. Yeah. So let's just talk about that moment when you decided that you were going to leave corporate healthcare and go out on your own. What were some of those things that you thought and kind of weighed the pros and cons in making that decision?
Yeah, it was definitely kind of a left turn. It actually came across the technology when I was doing my MBA at the University of Utah. The dean of the business school had asked me to take a look at some of the invention disclosures that the University of Utah had. As you're probably aware, the University of Utah Medical Center is kind of a renowned cardiology facility. And I was asked to take a look in terms of some of the invention disclosures that physicians and professors have submitted. I'll be honest, I regretted that offer almost immediately because about 3 days after I agreed to do that, I had 2 legal boxes full of paper files of invention disclosures. And I'll be honest, it was there's about 1,000 that were submitted, and about 990 of them were really elaborate solutions of problems that haven't been invented yet.
Oh my goodness.
Kind of the typical
problem with a lot of innovations today, right?
Exactly. The typical, tech spin out, kind of stuff. But I came across one that was really interesting. It was a nuclear physicist had an algorithm to be able to condense the time it takes to do cardiac PET. Again, going from 90 minutes down to 15 to 20 minutes. What was kind of interesting is that he saw the value of it, at least initially, was that it was going to be able to provide a better image, which it does. But I introduced myself to him and I educated him of, hey, to say that one image is better than another image usually involves a pretty lengthy clinical trial that would be difficult to try to finance. But being able to say that you take a 90-minute scan, condense it down to 20 minutes, that's something you don't need to do a clinical trial for, and the value is intrinsic. Mm-hmm. And so that night we decided to form an LLC and we started building the company up.
That's incredible. So you certainly have been had your way around, right, with med device corporations. Just kind of describe for our audience, what was some of that experience, some of the things that were most exciting to you and most challenging to you when you were innovating or working for those innovative companies around med device.
Yeah, well, what drew my attention to this technology was actually my time at GE Healthcare. I was there for about 12 years. And as a product marketing manager over the services unit, myself and my teammates were asked to kind of tackle kind of a serious problem that GE Healthcare had at the time. And that was they were losing service contracts for their OEM equipment or their GE equipment. And so oftentimes what was going on is that they would have, if you're aware, there's a CT system that's sold for about $2 million, but then also has a service contract to make sure that it's maintained and make sure the uptime is up. And those contracts can run about $150,000 to $200,000. What we ran into in a lot of cases, it was either former GE employees or oftentimes former Philips or Siemens employees were forming their own service companies and then going in and performing the services at a reduced price to General Electrics. Mm-hmm. And so marketing team was asked, hey, how can we address this? Because, we're losing our market share with this. And when we're getting business, we're starting to see price compression with our services. And so we were dealt with that problem. And we brainstormed and we came up with kind of a clever idea. This is happening during the late 90s, early 2000s, kind of in the middle of GE's Six Sigma renaissance, as you kind of like to call it, and where you use statistical tools to be able to make things more efficient. It's typically a manufacturing discipline. I had known from my experience that customers did not like being told about Six Sigma or being educated on Six Sigma, but we could see that this would actually be beneficial for this process. And during this time, all employees, including myself, had to complete at least one project or one assignment to be able to be Green Belt certified, they called it at the time. And what we decided to do is kind of lean into that. We had a lot of service engineers or managers like myself that had to do a project within a year. And so we came up with a performance solutions package for MRI and CT systems, where for a premium price, we would assign you a Green Belt specialist to go in and figure out how to make your scanning more efficient. And so utilizing those tools, the beauty of it is we never mentioned Six Sigma. We just said, no, this is a premium service package. Yep. And sure enough, it took off. We offered an uptime guarantee as well as a performance guarantee where if we failed to make it more efficient, that there would be money out of pocket for us. But we signed about 150 of those contracts and we never had to issue any guarantee checks whatsoever. So that was always kind of in the back of my mind of customers value having their capital equipment being more efficient. As you're aware, you got a pretty large capital asset, whether it's MRI or CT, and you've got a capitated reimbursement. So you're limited in terms of how profitable it could be for a healthcare facility. Right. Really, the only way you can make it more profitable is by getting more patients in, by improving the throughput. And so that was always kind of in the back of my head. And so when Dan Cattermison and I were able to go through his technology, that kind of sprang back to my mind of, here we go. Now we got a facility that's trying to do 7 to 8 patients a day. Wow, we can probably do like 25 patients a day. And so that's really was kind of where it stemmed from. It
all matters, doesn't it? It all just builds on each other.
Yeah. And what's nice about what we do at multifunctional imaging is that we like to say that we play well in the sandbox. And what we mean by that is every partner within the value chain of the scan benefits from our existence. So GE, Siemens, Philips, they benefit from the fact that their capital assets now more attainable because the return on investment is higher because they can get more patients in. The radio tracer companies or the drug distributors, they benefit from our existence because it's an opportunity for them to sell more radio tracers or sell more dose. The healthcare facilities benefit in that it's simply they benefit from the economies of scale. They're able to attain more revenue while still maintaining the operating expenses. And then lastly, the patient benefits the most because I'm sure a lot of your listeners have either been in a CT or a PET CT system before. It's pretty intimidating. And when you're talking about doing a rest and stress, it's 2 separate scans that the patient has to do. With our software, they're really only doing it once. And again, it's a much more pleasant experience. And so what's nice about us is we don't displace any of those value members. They all benefit from the existence of our software.
So one of the things I think is so interesting in what you just described is, in healthcare, we're almost always dealing with multi-sided markets, even if we're not even thinking about throughout the entire value chain. And you were able to so easily articulate the value proposition for each one of those players within that value chain. And I think that that's something that very often corporate innovators or, startup entrepreneurs, early stage entrepreneurs end up really missing out on is really, kind of sitting down and mapping out that business model and looking at the value prop for each stakeholder group that's involved in that value chain, as opposed to who the user is or who the buyer is, and missing components of the value and missing key components of that story.
Yeah, it's pretty unique. I've got, like I said, 20 plus years in the medtech industry. And I've always, from a commercial standpoint, always came into, all right, as an incumbent, I'm trying to upgrade a new product or service to something that they're currently using and buying, which presents a challenge. Or the tougher one, they're comfortable with the competitor that they're currently using, and you have to prove that you're that much better than that. So you're displacing something. Again, sometimes we have to have a sit down and explain this, because a lot of times customers don't get it. They feel that they're going to lose something, and we're able to say, no, actually, everything becomes more condensed. Everything becomes more efficient. Mm-hmm. And like I said, the equipment manufacturers benefit, drug manufacturers benefit, facility benefits, and again, most importantly, the patient benefits from a much more pleasant experience.
Sure. Yeah. So, so you talk about commercialization, adoption, launch. A lot of times people in the industry might use these words interchangeably, and I like to just kind of pick people's brains to kind of say, from your point of view, what's the difference between commercialization and launch or going to market, in your experience?
Yeah, well, I'm a big fan of the book Crossing the Chasm. And what Crossing the Chasm talks about is the various different stages of customers when you enter a new product or service. You have what's typically referred to as the early adopters, which are pretty much people that are in it for the technology alone. They're interested in how it's made, and they're also willing to kind of invest a lot of time to help you curate and develop your product. It's a really important group to embrace early on. But really, the goal is to get to that second stage, like they refer to as the early majority. And these are people that represent kind of a larger marketplace, but probably think a little bit more progressively. And the idea is to embrace your early adopters, but try to get to that second phase of that early majority as fast as possible, because those are typically the facilities that will act as, we like to refer to it as, pinball customers, where, say, a large key opinion leader facility decides to utilize this. Other key opinion leaders will fall in line when they see that it works for that person. And so moving to that early majority as soon as possible really benefits from being able to effectively commercialize and do it cost efficiently, because you have these key opinion leaders tacitly endorsing what the technology can do.
Beautiful. And just so
it's a lot more difficult than it sounds.
I didn't prompt you to say that, but this is one of my soapboxes, this early adoption strategy, and having a different strategy for those first two slices of the market versus the mainstream market. And what I found is that most innovators don't really understand that distinction. They're building one go-to-market strategy instead of a different one for those different slices of the market. And so then just really in the early stage of the company, wasting a whole lot of time trying to convince that mainstream market to buy their innovation. And there's this misalignment of messaging and the offer. And so what you just described is such a golden nugget for our audience and viewers to kind of grab a hold of. And how has that been a game changer for you in your own business?
Well, it's really helped for us. I mean, first of all, those early adopters that take on your technology for technology's sake, they're incredibly valuable, because those people are also typically the ones that give you the most feedback, which is absolutely golden when you're starting. But I think where sometimes, if you're a small entrepreneurial company, sometimes you can fall a little bit too much in love with that type of customer. And we need to be able to do and kind of have the discipline of The second you know you have that product dialed in, okay, it's like, it is ready to go now. You got to transition that discipline to, we need to go to that larger early majority customer now, even though it's scary, even though it might be a little bit tough to get their attention at first. It's imperative that you make that transition very quickly.
So how are you finding those early adopters in the first two slices of that? How are you finding those? What are you looking for that's different than some of the mainstream market players that are going to be so much more resistant to what you have to offer early on?
Yeah, in our case, and this might not be everybody's case, my partner and co-founder Dan Cattermas is he's a known quantity within the nuclear medicine space, and we are able to use a lot of his relationships that he had to the type of people that could really help us craft and be able to tell us, yes, okay, this is functioning the way it should. And then what I kind of brought to the table a little bit is myself with kind of broader commercial experience at GE and Becton Dickinson and Biosense Webster. I was able, once we were ready to go to that larger scale, be able to take my contacts and say, all right, I was 1 or 2 degrees removed from a lot of those contacts, but was able to translate over. So for instance, when we had our small consortium saying, yes, all right, we're ready to go, Dan and I immediately said, all right, let's transition this and let's go to the Mayo Clinic. And let's try to get the adoption over there because that's representative of an early majority customer.
Right. Yep. That makes sense. And then I love what you're touching on too. And I think it's so important is how those early buyers really are the ones that help you sell into cross the chasm and sell into the mainstream market. So just kind of talk about a couple of stories maybe on some folks that, what was that like for you, being able to help facilitate that endorsement or that that word of mouth to help you cross the chasm?
Yeah, well, we were pretty fortunate in that, as you know, trying to get to those early majority customers, you have a lot of value analysis committees that you have to go through. And again, you're in a lot of those cases, you're trying to displace an incumbent. Okay, you're trying to say that we're 5% better than what you're currently using right now. What we were able to be able to drive home, especially with people outside of our internal champions, was, hey, this is a cost savings for you. This is an efficiency tool for you. You're going to be able to go from scanning 7 times a day to 30 times a day without any incremental operating expenses to be able to do that. So we were pretty fortunate in that we had a really good economic story of why adopting this just as soon as possible was going to be a benefit. We weren't talking about making improvements in the single digit range. We were talking about, hey, you could double your scanning throughput just simply by adopting the software. And so that's what really helped us out. That's what makes us a little bit unique.
Hey, it's Dr. Roxy here with a quick break from the conversation. Are you trying to figure out what moves you need to make to survive and thrive in the new COVID economy? I want every health innovator to find their most viable and profitable pivot strategy, which is why I created the COVID Proof Your Business Pivot Kit. The Pivot Kit is a step-by-step framework that helps you find your best pivot strategy. It walks you through 6 categories you need to examine for a 360-degree view of your business. I call them the 6 critical pivot lenses. As you make your way through this comprehensive kit, you'll be armed with the tools, tips, and strategies you need to make sure you can pivot with speed without missing out on critical details and opportunities. Learn more at legacy-dna.com/kit.
So how have you maybe nurtured or cultivated those KOL relationships?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we've had a great relationship with the Mayo Clinic, and they have written a paper speaking to our technology, which has been especially helpful for us with that. And, and again, they walk through sort of like their base case of how their scanner utilization before our arrival. And then after, I think it was about 6 months of utilizing our software, what their throughput was at that point. And so having that paper that they penned was extremely helpful for us. And we're able to showcase that to not only end users, but also other companies that would have an interest in terms of distributing our software for us or partnering with us.
So I know our audience wants to know, how did you get them to do that, right? Because in healthcare, I mean, it's just this weird thing where, you can't put my logo on anything. Yes, you've been a great customer. I mean, great customer. Like, we have a great relationship, but no, you can't include me in your slide deck. You can't put me on your website, kind of thing, right? It's just kind of a known thing in healthcare that maybe other industries don't encounter. So was that something that you guys initiated? Was it something that Mayo initiated? What kind of spurred that?
Oh, it was something that we initiated. I tell you what, there's not a lot of magic to it. It's really about persistence, especially when you go to larger facilities. A lot of it is simply just the repetition and never accepting no as an answer. Or I'd like to say is no is the second best answer you can get, as long as you follow up with, well, what else do we have to do? If this isn't enough, what would be enough? And what you got to do is the 15th time you run into that, don't roll your eyes, don't sigh, just say, that's interesting. Okay, how could we address this so you'll be able to adopt this? Right, and so again, perseverance is really the secret.
Yep. Just be stubborn. Don't give up.
Exactly.
So I made note here when you were talking earlier, telling about the story. You said that you were an early stage, startup med device company, but that you started the company in 2012, and we're in 2021, right?
Yeah. So what we did is for instance, I did this as sort of like a side while my partner worked on this full time, and so we originally started doing the fundraising path and fundraising trail. What we discovered pretty quickly was we had some interesting offers from venture capitalists. There's also some private equity, and there's some strategic investments that were kind of brought to our attention. We decided to take a little bit different a route in that we sought federal and state grants that were non-dilutive to be able to build our company out. Now, the positive to that was, well, we have control of the organization. We don't have a third-party entity that's driving our strategy. The downside is that it makes much more a deliberate rollout. And so after myself and my partners looked at it, we decided that our IP was strong enough that let's do this deliberately. And so we built it out slowly. We got our 510K in 2018. So 5 years after kind of the founding, we were able to get our 510K. And I tell you what, it wasn't easy. It was a long walk through the desert for all of us.
How many times did you want to quit?
Oh yeah, and there's something to be said. Being in a startup sometimes can be very romantic, but until you recognize that, okay, wow, payroll's Friday, and we might not have the funds for payroll. That's real stress. And that's when you recognize, okay, this is what being an entrepreneur is really like. But yeah, we've been commercial since 2018, and again, we're methodically building out our base because we know that if you make things more efficient, the economic story becomes that much more impactful. And so, we're going about showcasing the fact with our customers of how much more efficient it could be.
So how are you building awareness and building that demand in front of your targeted customers, especially in this kind of, it's not COVID, it's not post-COVID, it's just this quasi-COVID climate that we're in?
Yeah, good question. My partner, Dan Cattermas, is, again, a very known quantity in nuclear medicine. And so a lot of his relationships are able to help us do that. We recently hired a product manager who's, very commercially focused, who's driving, adoption with that. What also we benefited from is there's other companies within the space that participate in that value chain that I spoke of earlier, that set up introductions for us to be able to come in and talk about what we're doing because it benefits them. it's nice where we're not contractually obligated. For instance, they're not acting as a distributor, but again, they're setting up warm invitations for us and say, hey, are you aware what these people at multifunctional imaging are doing? This might be a benefit to your facility, which is fantastic. And they would hand that over to us, and then boom, we're talking to an end user about what exactly we're doing. So we've really kind of benefited from that word of mouth of companies within that value chain.
So a lot of the research that I've done indicates exactly what you just said, that building that strong partnership network is key to crossing the chasm. Like if you don't have that network, you will really just kind of fall in and flounder. So that makes a lot of sense. In just this word of mouth, this KOL, this partnership, kind of having that engine behind you. Again, so you don't even have to be the one that's creating all of that awareness and demand, right? You've kind of got that exponential effect with other people doing it on your behalf. Even if you were, had millions of dollars to put into your sales and marketing efforts.
Yeah, and I've had a career where if I'm trying to tell a customer of why my good or service is better than, say, another, I would have to get a pen and a piece of paper out, or have to get an iPad out and say, well, this is why. With multifunctional imaging, it's like, okay, you're doing 8 patients a day right now. With us, we can get you to 16 or 20. And right. So I think those adjacent companies, they can kind of be a good advocate for us because our value proposition is so simple.
Yeah. Yeah. So I noticed, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned something about Jack Welch, obviously, the leadership program. I'm a professor at the Jack Welch Management Institute. And I have to say that the way he runs that school, or the leads that school, is like he would do at GE. It's unlike any other university that I've ever attended or ever worked for, where the students are customers, just like you would in any other business.
No, I had the opportunity to go to Crotonville, as you know, it's kind of called internally. Yeah. It was beneficial in 2 different ways. You kind of get assigned you typically room with another person from GE at that. And so I remember I roomed with a Soviet or a Russian national who worked in the aircraft engine unit. So it was like great having that experience of, wow, you're from Russia. Tell me about that.
Exactly.
And it's like, walk me through how actually a jet engine works. So you benefit from those relationships. And then, like you said, I would say the class that I was in, probably about a third of the class was actually customers. And so that's another dynamic.
Oh, wow.
And it's good. It was, in my case, it was a week-long program. You're kind of pulled out of the field. You're told to put your cell phone down and let your team know that you're not going to be responsive that week. And no, it's fantastic. I cherish my time at GE. The entire playbook doesn't transition outside of GE. There's some of it that you kind of got to leave, but some of it you carry directly over. For instance, how the fact that you value feedback to your employees as well as to your customers. Being disciplined to share feedback. The planning process, both strategic and operating, is something I still lean on today, even though I left GE quite a while ago. But yeah, there's some of it that doesn't carry over. That's why you see a lot of people from GE excel in other areas, though, because they pick up those nice nuggets or pearls that translate anywhere.
Yeah, that's great. So you did touch on a business plan, and I think every founder has a business plan of some sort. If we all stacked our business plans side by side, they probably would look very, very differently in a number of ways. So what are some of the key components? I mean, you don't have to go through like the basics of business plan, but what are some of the key components that you have found that has been like the components or the strategies that have been really key to success that you've accomplished so far?
Yeah, well, it's funny you should ask that question, because my partner and I, we had a little bit of fun about 6 months ago where we pulled out our original business plan from 2012. Wow.
Yeah. And it's exactly what you're doing today, right?
Yeah. The logo still looks the same. That's not the only thing that's maintained. I tell you what, it's twofold. What I've carried over from GE is the two-step process. They refer to as the session one, session two. The timing of it's not necessarily important, but GE in the springtime would do what's called their session one. And this is the 5-year business plan. And really what it's about is, I always joked about it was defending your life, meaning that tell me about the market. Tell me about the competitive threats. Tell me why this is even going to be an industry 5 years from now. So it was less about what we were actually doing. It was like, tell me about the market.
Yeah.
And really they were evaluating, is this a good space to be in? Right. And there was a lot of decisions that was made at that meeting by, hey, what are the external drivers? How do we know that, patients are going to continue to need this type of therapy? So that was beneficial. And then
I imagine that's why they're not like Kodak or Blockbuster, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then in the fall was referred to as session two. And that was, this is how the next year is going to roll out. This is, our direct competitive threats. This is what our revenue is going to be. This is what our expenses are going to be. And it was much more of an operating plan type of scenario. So we have adopted that, where we do that twice a year, kind of in the springtime, more strategic, fall, a lot more operating focus. But when you're in a small company, you got to be a lot less rigid. You got to be a lot more open-minded to, okay, that was a good idea 3 months ago, but we're going to divert our path now and be able to do something like this. And so when you're in a large company, like a GE, like a Siemens, it is kind of like a battleship. Okay, in that you got a course, and this is what the entire plan is set up for. This is what shareholders are expecting, and we're going to do it this way. When you're entrepreneurial, it's like you have to be able to adapt to what the market has been able to serve up to you.
I encourage all of our clients to create these 90-day plans, because I say that, once you go beyond that, like there's so much that changes, especially in this climate that we're, operating under right now. I mean, so much changes. And so I think that's, the beauty of being a startup or being a co-founder, right? You get a chance to pivot and adapt and iterate in a much faster way than you can when you're this big behemoth organization like a GE or a BD.
Yeah, and I think also what's really beneficial when you're in a smaller, more agile environment is that you can invite your customer in to help you with that strategic mindset. I worked for a small private equity firm a couple of years ago, and worked in the electronic healthcare record space, and we're able to sign on a really large EHR player, one of the two big players. And we're able to come in after we got them on board and we were helping them out. I asked for a meeting with their executive team. And I asked them hey, how are we doing? Went through some dashboards. Are we performing well? They said, wow, you guys are performing great. We're really happy we adopted you guys' service. And then I said, well, okay, that's great. Can I ask you a favor? And they're like, sure, whatever it be, Dave. And I said, what else could we be doing for you? I think that there's other services or other types of things that we might be able to do for you. What might some of those be? And I'll never forget, the chief compliance officer stood up with a marker, went to the whiteboard and said, we've got all these different things that we have 7 different vendors taking care of for us. And I'm sitting here feverishly writing all this down. And after about 45 minutes, he stops, he puts the cap on his pen and he goes, you know what? You owe me dinner tonight. And I was like, well, why do I owe you dinner tonight? He's like, I just gave you your strategy.
Exactly.
Yeah, you did. Yes, you did. And so I'm always grateful for that meeting.
That's such a great story, a real story, personal example of, this idea of co-creation that I'm always preaching for and advocating for. And I hope that more organizations do it, whether you're big or whether you're small, being able to invite customers into the conversation, into our R&D teams, our marketing teams, our sales teams, in not being embarrassed by asking those questions, right? You had to kind of put the ego at the door and be humble to say, hey, well, what do you want next? Instead of acting like what they want next.
Exactly.
And I think that the companies that adopt co-creation are going to be the ones that win, because they're going to stay closest to the customer and they're going to be able to deliver what the customer wants in a way that's going to be very different than those organizations that are making a lot of assumptions and building their strategies and product solutions based upon that.
Yeah, it was very fortunate. I think that one, he saw that we were a small company that was hustling, and that we were, really working hard to exceed their expectations, and we have some credibility too with that. And again, I think this individual came up with like 12 fantastic ideas, and I came back to him a week later and said, you know what, I think we can do 3 of these, and they ended up being really good. And trust me, I want to do all of them, but again, being a company of limited means, we had to take the high runners.
Sure.
And, it was great. And he enjoyed a steak dinner that night. So, yeah.
Well, and I think that discernment that you just described is also extremely critical, because you're also looking through that lens. Okay, the customer provided these 12 ideas, but that doesn't mean that all 12 of them are viable or feasible. Being able to commercialize them across the entire ecosystem, or more customers. It could be just this one particular customer, and I think that goes back to what you were talking about earlier on, when you've got that small sliver, that first sliver that's really like into technology for technology's sake, and you don't want to get caught up in the trap of building customizing something for them, and they kind of take over that product development, and then you've got something that's really great for these 3 customers.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. You got to be thinking of what the early majority customer really wants. Mm-hmm. That's where that's your North Star that you got to follow.
Sure. Yeah. So Dave, this has been a fantastic conversation. Is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners before we wrap up today?
No, I just want to thank you very much for allowing myself to talk about multifunctional imaging. You can find multifunctional imaging at multifunctionalimaging.com. You can also look me up on LinkedIn if you want to reach out to myself. And my email address is dave.dolan at mfimage.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Dr. Roxy, it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. I know you're busy working to bring your life-changing innovation to market, and I value your time and attention. To get the latest episodes on your mobile device automatically, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. Thank you for listening, and I appreciate everyone who shared the show with friends and colleagues. See you on the next episode of Health Innovators.